Dr. Jill Harkavy Friedman leads the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention's Growing Research Grant Program. She works with over 200 scientific advisors to evaluate progress in the field and chart next areas of inquiry to yield impactful insights and strategies for suicide prevention. In her more than 35 years of experience, both as a clinician and a researcher, she has always been passionate about translating research into practice. Dr. Harkavy Friedman has published over 100 articles, and she works closely with AFSP's education, communication, and public policy and advocacy teams to develop programs and messages to ensure they follow the best practices in suicide prevention and reflect the latest findings in research. Dr. Harkavy Friedman earned her bachelor degree in psychology at the University of Pennsylvania and her master's degree and doctorate in clinical psychology at the University of Florida. She completed her pre-doctoral internship at Yale New Haven Hospital. In 1984, she joined Montefiore Medical Center, Albert Einstein College of Medicine, as an assistant professor, where she established the Adolescent Depression and Suicide Program. In 1989, Dr. Harkavy Friedman moved to Columbia University, New York State Psychiatric Institute, first as an assistant professor, and later as an associate professor of clinical psychology in psychiatry. As a licensed psychologist, she maintains a clinical practice in Manhattan. So please welcome Dr. Jill Harkavy Friedman, who will be speaking on From Research to Practice, What We Have Learned for Suicide Prevention.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here, and thank you all for attending the conference and learning about suicide. And I'm going to just open my screen so that we can see the slides. The whole point of research, of course, is to improve clinical practice. I mean, that's our goal, right? We're studying things so that we can make things better for people. And in suicide prevention, we're studying things so that we can save lives and bring hope. That is actually our mission at AFSP. So what I hope to do today is share how we make that translation from research to practice. So goals for today are to be able to describe at least 3 research findings about preventing suicide, enumerate 2 clinical treatments that may have emerged from that research, and then to present examples of research findings that relate the human brain to inform clinical practice. So I want to start by saying a word about AFSP. So we started in 1987, and we gave out $11,000 that year. It was a first. And the goal, it was started by researchers and families of people who lost loved ones to suicide. And the idea was to sustain a private source of funding for suicide prevention research, because quite frankly, there wasn't that much going on with the government about suicide. And also we want to supplement the efforts of the government supportive research. Now we're the leading private funder of suicide research, and we have over 230 experts who aid us in that process. And so the reason we invest in all this research is that from research, we gain the knowledge that's necessary to develop educational programs. And then those programs are brought into the public through public awareness. We also use this information to advocate for mental health and suicide prevention legislation, both on a federal and a state level. And then we also support outreach and support for those affected by suicide, either people with lived experience or people who've lost someone to suicide. And of course, all that goes back to improve our research program, because research is a process where, it's not like we found an answer and we're done. It's a process of learning. And I'm going to talk a lot about that. So how do we do that? So like I said, in 1987, we funded $11,000 worth of research. And just to give you an idea of where we are today, this past funding cycle, we funded over $6.4 million worth of research. And that brought us 35 new innovation grants and 2 $1.5 million, what we call focus grants. And I'll talk very little bit about that because I do want to get to what we've learned. But right now, like today, Our current portfolio of active studies is about 22 million. So we went from 11,000 to 22 million. I have to say, I myself got my first research grant from AFSP in 1992. It was $10,000, but I was able to use that study to then get a larger grant from the National Institute of Mental Health. And that's really what we hope for people. We're here to fund all types of research: neurobiological, genetic, psychosocial, clinical treatment studies, community intervention, survivors of suicide loss. These studies need to be related to suicide because there isn't that much funding towards suicide research. So we are focused on suicide, but anything that is going to be lead us to learn more. And we don't expect every study to have an immediate consequence in understanding suicide, but we expect that they will help to lay the groundwork so that we can learn more and more. And I'm going to go through sort of a little bit of the process of research and how that's led us to our current clinical practices. So one of the things that we do is we fund all types of researchers, and we're putting a lot of effort now into building a research community. You know, when I got into the field, I would say it wasn't even a field. In fact, I got into it because nobody would study teen suicide. I went to Montefiore and the chairman said, I want somebody to do research in teen suicide and set up a clinic. And reminded me of I was at a wedding once where the bride threw the bouquet and all the women stepped back. You know, nobody would do it for like 3 years. And then I got there, I was a new, 27-year-old PhD. And I was like, okay, I'll do that. And honestly, that's how I got into the field. Nobody would touch it. So think about where we are today. Yesterday was World Suicide Prevention Day. Just at AFSP, we had a whole day of events related to raising awareness and understanding about suicide and its impact. So we are having a very robust conversation now because we're all realizing the importance. We've all been affected by suicide in one way or another. And we've learned something from the research. So we fund all kinds of researchers, senior researchers, young researchers. We're actually going to start, going to colleges and sort of plant the seed that this is a great field to come into because it is a very small field, but it's a growing field. And we are looking for at AFSP innovation. We're looking for things that have never been done before that'll help explain, tight methodology, so really sound studies, and impact, either today or down the road. And you'll see how one study becomes the baseline information for the next study. And that's how research works. You answer one question, you get 3 more. So, but we're not really able to fund the most definitive studies, but we are able to move the field. So like National Institute of Health and NIMH now know that if someone got a result from our study, they were innovative, had tight methodology, and there will be an impact at some point. And so a lot of our grantees, about 70–80% of our grantees go on to get larger grants based on their AFSP studies, just as I did. But we do share the findings, and you're welcome to come to our website, afsp.org. You're also welcome to subscribe to our Research Connection newsletter and we have a Research Connection researcher program. That came out a little weird, where our communities, as you probably know by now, AFSP has chapters all over the country. I think we have 72 right now in all 50 states. And those chapters are able to bring researchers who conducted research funded by AFSP to their community to have a conversation about their research and their findings. And it's such a great program because the community gets to ask questions and also say, hey, this is what's important. And the researchers find it really enriching to learn what are people really concerned about, and can I study that? And so it's great for everybody. Some of them are online videos if you want to watch them, but if you look at your local chapter's calendar or on our national website, you can see them. And in fact, Dr. Toomey has done several Research Connection programs for us. And his RCP, as we call it, is on our website. We also developed these researcher videos. These are like 1 to 2 minute videos that take a topic related to suicide, and our researcher try to explain it in just regular language. And I'm going to use a few of them during my presentation so you can get the idea. There are about 80 or 90, and we're about to release some new ones, so you don't have to watch them all the time, but we want people to learn from them and also share them, tweet them out, put them on your social media. These are ways that you can help inform the public about suicide and suicide prevention. And if you go to afsp.org/learning more, or just go to afsp.org and put in videos, they'll come up. And we also work with the media to, when events happen, it's easy to have misinformation that comes into the media, or the language isn't exactly right for how to talk about suicide so that it's helpful and not harmful. And so we do a lot of work sharing our research findings with the media. So as you can see, we're very dedicated not just to funding research, but also using the findings of the research to improve suicide prevention efforts. So I'm just you probably heard this already, but I just want to review the scope of the problem. Okay, so yeah, you probably heard that the rate of suicide most recently, which was down a little bit, we're kind of hopeful, was 13.93 people per 100,000. And that translated in 2019 to 47,511 people, or 0.014% of the population. I'm talking about these different things because rate doesn't always tell you the whole story. It does depend on the number of people in the population. So you've probably learned that the Native American youth have an extraordinarily high rate of suicide, and it's very distressing. And there's actually lots of efforts going on in that area. If you're talking about number of people, however, then you're talking about 500 people a year. Whereas if you are talking about men, you're talking about over 70% of the 47,511 people who died by suicide. So we feel every death is tragic, and we hope to avoid as many deaths as we can. Though we know, we can't avoid every death from heart disease or diabetes, but we're doing better in our prevention. So many people think about suicide, almost 4% a year, so which translates into about 12.2 million people. That's a lot of people. Some people attempt suicide, about 0.5% per year. And fortunately, way fewer die by suicide. So even though you might think of suicide as being on a continuum from ideation to attempts, it doesn't really work that way. So that while they're related to each other, it doesn't translate one-to-one from somebody thinking about it to then going on to dying by suicide. And this is really important because when somebody says they're thinking of suicide, we have to have a further conversation to really figure out what the risk is. And of course, we want to intervene for anybody because they're likely to be in distress. But sometimes, particularly in certain settings, there's this like knee-jerk reaction. Oh my God, somebody's thinking of suicide, call the police. And we don't have to do that. And by the end of this presentation, I'm hoping you'll see that and the reason that we don't have to do that. So knowing the difference between ideation and people who make attempts and people who die by suicide is really important. And then, of course, as Nancy Turek just talked about, the aftermath of suicide and complicated grief, which we funded the suicide arm of that study. So one thing I want to start with is to give you a model of how to think about suicide. This comes from the research. I'm not going to cite specific studies because it comes from a whole body of research, really starting in 1987, to tell the truth. But there's never one single cause of suicide. And this is a really hard idea for everybody because it's easier to think about something if you know one cause. But suicide is complex. And this is kind of how we understand it happening. Now, this is one model of many models. This is at a level that may be different from other models you've heard. But we think of it as there are interacting risk and protective factors. And I think Dr. Moutier may have mentioned this model as a way of saying that the pandemic doesn't cause suicide, right? But there are certain people who are at greater risk who may be more likely to engage in suicidal behavior with that kind of stress. So this is what we see. We see bullying, we see job loss, we see criminal behavior, we see all kinds of things. And our mind automatically says, oh, they killed themselves because they were bullied, or they killed themselves because they lost their job, or they're getting divorced. And while that contributes to suicide, it's not the underlying cause. Because if you think about it, unemployment, if everybody was unemployed, died by suicide, we would have a severe reduction in our population right now from suicide. So it's not how it works. But in the background, there are all these other factors, and we all have them, right? Biological factors, psychosocial factors, and environmental factors that are kind of always there. So we have genetics, we have sometimes mental health conditions, chronic health conditions, chronic pain. Sometimes a person has a head trauma, or genetic risk for suicide, and also substance use, history of trauma, unsupportive environment. All these factors are kind of happening in the background. And when they align in a certain way in the context of stress, if there's access to lethal means, a person could die by suicide. And guessing you might have heard about limiting access to lethal means. And of course, I'm going to say it quite a few times, but I'm going to try and explain how come it works and what it does based on the research. So we have all these factors, and some of them are protective factors. You know, you have the support, you feel connected. The stress doesn't affect you in the same way as when you're feeling isolated and disconnected. So it's a very dynamic model, and that helps us to understand the reason that suicide urges come and go. Now, some people have them in an ongoing way. We still don't understand what leads them to act on it at one point and not another. But for many people, it comes and goes. And if we can help people get through, this is one thing we've learned, if we can help people get through those crises that have a beginning, a middle, and an end, we can help them stay alive through that crisis. So now I'm going to share a video with you.
One of the big advances in our understanding around suicide in the last 10 years is this idea that the factors that lead you to become suicidal are different from the factors that lead you to attempt suicide. So we often talk about this phased transition, or going from what is it that happens, somebody who has thoughts of suicide and doesn't go any further, doesn't attempt suicide. How are they similar or different from somebody who crosses the precipice to attempt suicide? And the work that we do in terms of the psychological model that I've developed is try to understand that transition, that movement from thinking to acting, thinking to attempting suicide, or sadly dying by suicide. So when I think about what leads someone to suicide, I try and think of the complexity, and we all recognize the complexity of suicide. And I suppose one of the messages that I learned very early on was that there's never one single risk factor. And the work that we've done looking at this pathway, this transition from thinking to acting, suggests that a group of factors that I call volitional moderators, which is a technical term, but what it really means is volitional factors are things like impulsivity. So the more impulsive you are, the more likely you are to make that transition from thinking to attempting suicide. The greater exposure to suicide that you have. So knowing people close to you, family and close friends who've taken their own life, makes it more likely that you will attempt suicide. That's another volitional phase factor. We know that physical pain sensitivity, or the notion of capacity or capability for suicide, makes it more likely that you'll attempt suicide. So if you have a high physical pain tolerance, if you are fearless about dying, these are two factors which are key to the transition from thinking about suicide to attempting suicide. And we also know the extent to which you've planned or imagined suicide, we think. Also, imagining yourself dead is a contributory factor to this transition from thinking to acting. In my sort of thinking, I've developed this model of suicide, which really looks at entrapment as being sort of part of this key final pathway to suicide. And entrapment is this sense of which I can't escape. And that suicide, to the mind of the individual, is often not about wanting to die, but it's about wanting the pain of entrapment to end.
So that's Dr. Rory O'Connor, and he has a very well-developed theory about suicide and trying to understand that transition, one of many theories that there are. But one thing we have learned is that 90% of people who die by suicide have an underlying and potentially treatable mental health condition. Remember, just because you have a mental health condition, you may not have it forever, or if you have adequate treatment, you may be fine with that treatment. It's when you stop that treatment where you may run into trouble. Now, you may have heard from the CDC, and I want to clarify the discrepancy between what the CDC said, where they said that basically about half of people did not have a known diagnosed mental health condition at the time of their death. So how do we end up saying that 90% of people have a mental health condition and they end up saying less than 50%? This is how. The 90% comes from psychological autopsy studies, where 3 to 5 family members and friends are interviewed with the same interview, each individually, not as a group, because everybody needs to tell their story. Lifetime medical records are gathered, police records, and other information. And those sources of information are compiled to look at whether or not the person who died had, of one of many things, did they have a mental health diagnosis? And they literally take the criteria for the diagnosis and try to figure out whether the person had it or not. And there are 30 plus studies that have found in this format that 90% of people, including kids, by the way, have a mental health condition. Now, the CDC statement comes from a really important source of data, the National Violent Death Reporting System, which we advocated for all the way through to getting it in all 50 states. And now we're advocating for boosting up the funding so they can really do the work that needs to be done. But that comes from 3 sources: the medical examiner, the police record, and any medical records that are associated with the death. So you can see that they have to answer one question in the NVDRS, which is, does the person have a current mental health problem? Yes, no, or unknown. Whereas the psychoautopsy, uses the structured interview, and it evaluates a broad range of mental health conditions. Now, one other thing to keep in mind is that the CDC number does not include the 25% of people that they identified as having a substance use related disorder. So if you add those people in as having a mental health disorder, which it is, you're already at 75% of people who die by suicide. And then essentially there's no missing data because somebody will report on people in a psychological autopsy study, whereas, at this point, there is a considerable amount of missing data. And missing data to that question, the one question, did this person have a mental health condition? The rate is pretty high. So you can see how we end up in 2 different places, depending on which method you're using. Nonetheless, just about 50% of people who died by suicide and were studied in the NVDRS had documented mental health conditions. So this is really important when you're thinking about mental health. So mental health plays a role in suicide, but it's not the whole story. Most people with mental health conditions don't engage in suicidal behavior, and there are many other contributors. Because if it was the whole story, if we could really account for 90% of people who die by suicide, we wouldn't need all this research. But most people with mental health conditions do not die by suicide, fortunately. So here's another research finding. Suicide is related to brain functions that affect decision-making and behavioral control, making it difficult for people to find positive solutions. Now, that's a really complex statement, and just a word about the fact that until 1974, nobody even thought about the brain contributing to suicide. I mean, that sounds really off now when we think about it. But the first studies about the brain and suicide were about how the brain was damaged when somebody tried to kill themselves or killed themselves, rather than what was the brain's contribution to suicide. And we actually funded one of the first studies in this area, Dr. Arango's, to take a look at this picture. There's a control brain and a suicide brain. Do they look the same? I think we can see that they don't look the same. Now, this is in the raphe nucleus. And so in this part of the brain, people who die by suicide actually have more serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter, than people who don't die by suicide. That may sound contrary because we know that in the frontal lobes, people who die by suicide have less serotonin, and that's because the brain is dynamic. And so in some areas there's more, in some areas there's less. Now take a look at this picture. Do they look the same? I don't think so. Again, there are obvious physical differences in these brains of people who died by suicide versus people who didn't. Now, I want you to remember that dying by suicide may be a little bit different from making a suicide attempt or thinking about suicide. And this is one of the areas where we don't know when those brain changes show up and what they mean. But the brains are definitely different. And so Vicky Arango did this amazing study, and she found that serotonin, a neurotransmitter associated with suicide, was decreased in the frontal cortex, and there was more in the brainstem. And she worked with Dr. John Mann, and they've literally spent their whole careers looking at serotonin as it's related to suicide at a transmitter level, as a brain structural level, as brain functional level, to really try to understand how this works. But we do know something about the frontal lobes. That's this part right here, the executive part, function part of the brain, that it directs behavior, that it directs whether or not you will inhibit a behavior. In other words, it's the part of the brain that says, don't do that, or let it go. So when people are engaging in risky behavior, that part of the brain is not really telling them, hey, watch out. And then also it's involved in decision-making. In other words, how flexible. Now, when we're feeling well, we can look at a situation and say, well, here's the problem. I could do this, or I could do that, or I could do this. But in a person who's suicidal, this is my little, it's hard to find these kinds of images, but this is what your brain is doing, right? It's doing it for you so that you make a decision. But we found that a study funded by Jeff Bridge in kids showed that adolescents who made a suicide attempt actually weighed the risks and benefits differently. And they had trouble learning new tasks. So imagine that I could do this or I could do that, kind of gets narrower and narrower, and may end up with a person who's about to die by suicide saying, this is the only thing that I can do. And they have trouble learning new tasks. And this is why when a person is in a suicidal crisis, they don't have access to their usual coping. So we could end up looking at someone and saying, they were doing so great, they were so smart, they were in all these clubs. But in that moment, and it's not just a moment in time, but they don't have access to any of that. They're feeling, like Dr. O'Connor said, they're feeling desperate and pain. So we've also funded Dr. Kati, she goes by, Santo, to study suicidal behavior in the elderly and using brain imaging with that and neurocognitive tests. And they found that older people were making more errors in recognizing emotion, perceiving problems like really more negative, that's kind of doomsday thinking. They were more impulsive in their behavior, less behavioral control, and they weren't that great at problem solving. So these are elderly people who made suicide attempts relative to people who didn't. And this is one of the methods that we use to study. So then we had the great fortune that Dr. Bridge and Dr. Zanto and also Dr. John Kelp applied to us to study suicidal behavior and cognition over the lifespan. And they couldn't really take somebody and study them from teenage years all the way to 60, 70 years old. So what they did is they're each specialists in different areas. So each of them used the same measures in teens, sort of general 30 to 40-year-old group, and in the elderly. And they also measured from their sites the other two groups, just so we don't have what we call a site-specific problem. Like it's not really about teens, it's about Jeff Bridge and his group. So they did this study, and what did they find? Well, they did find that depression is a little bit different. And in older people than younger people, and it's more involved with rumination. Kind of, if you think about it, that's how we portray it. Clinical traits improved over the lifespan, but neurocognitive abilities, thinking, got worse over the lifespan. And they also found that some kinds of clinical traits, like borderline personality traits, aggression, memory, ability to categorize things quickly, that all of those things in people who made suicide attempts were already dysfunctional, starting in the teenage years all the way through the lifespan. So basically, these three groups of people evidence the same basic neurocognitive differences that we mentioned with executive functioning and problem solving, even though the nature of their depression or disorder changed over time. And so that again highlights how suicide is related to mental health, but it's not just about mental health. Hope you guys are with me so far. We also learned that genes play a role in suicide. And I'm going to share another video with you.
Epigenetic is a new field in genetic research, and it deals with the RNA, not with the DNA. The DNA is where all the information is written. So I get information from my father and my mother, each one of us, and we have alleles of specific genes that are written in the DNA. DNA is like a book with letters that says you are going to have blue eyes or brown eyes, you are going to be tall or short, smart or not so smart, and so on. Epigenetics is dealing with translation of this book into action. So if you have these letters in your DNA that says that you are supposed to have a specific protein like serotonin in your brain, in order to have this serotonin in your brain, you need to translate this book into a protein. And this translation happens in another particle that's called RNA. So epigenetics deals with RNA, deals with changes on DNA and controlling the DNA in different ways. Or in other words, there are particles in our brain that can turn on and off our genes. So even if we have the genetic load for something like depression or suicide, it can be demonstrated or not. And this depends on the environment.
So I'm guessing that many of us have heard about RNA these days because that's how the new vaccines, 2 of the 3 new vaccines for COVID actually work through the RNA. They changed that messenger. So what he's saying is your DNA is there, but what happens with it can be changed and affected in many ways by the environment. So keep that in mind, because I'm going to come back to that. It's the idea that just because you have these risk factors for suicide doesn't mean that you're going to end up taking your life. And this is a big fear that many people who have a family member who died by suicide have, that they are destined to die by suicide. And we know that that's not true. And I'm going to tell you more about that. But from a genetic standpoint, it's not true because your environment affects the impact of your genes. Take a breath. Okay, another research finding, and I think you heard of this before, but that limiting access to lethal means of killing yourself dramatically decreases suicide rates in communities. In other words, up to 40% of suicides can be prevented if you remove access to lethal means that someone is planning to use. Now, that doesn't mean every suicide, that's 40%, but we don't have anything else that has that kind of prevention rate. So it's really important to keep that in mind. And it's really important for us to have these conversations. So I'm going to show another video about this because our researchers tell these stories, I think, so well that you don't need to just hear it from me.
When I think about firearms and suicide, I think of them as 2 problems that are intrinsically linked and overlapping. I think you can't talk about suicide without talking about guns, and you can't talk about gun deaths without talking about suicide. when you look at suicides as a whole, about 50% are by guns. So across the board, among all suicide deaths, half of them occurred with a firearm. If you flip that statistic and want to look at gun deaths, we know that about 60% nationwide are due to suicide. Where I live in Colorado, about 78% of our gun deaths are suicides. And so you really, they're so closely linked, we've got to talk about them both. And importantly, there are things that we can do to prevent those firearm suicides. Things like counseling and safer storage and working with communities. We think overall, having a firearm in the home increases the risk of suicide maybe about 3 times or so. But what's really important to know is it's not because people who own guns are more likely to be suicidal. It's that in that moment of crisis and maybe impulsivity, a firearm is a very deadly method is a lethal weapon. That's what it's supposed to be. And so a person who attempts suicide with a gun doesn't usually get a second chance to call for help or to make it to the ER where I can try to do something. So when we talk about reducing access to firearms or lethal means counseling or lethal means safety, what that really is this message of putting time and space between someone at risk and the weapon. It could be locking the firearms up so that the person at risk doesn't have access. It could be moving them out of the house. It could be never owning a gun in the first place if it's, you're someone with chronic risk. But again, we're not talking about laws and policies. We're really talking about safe storage. I think the best analogy is probably the drunk driving analogy, that friends don't let friends drive drunk. If your buddy's had too much to drink, you don't call the cops to take away his license, but you make sure he gets home safely. And it's, I think, really the same kind of message.
I bet you might not know, if you look at our state fact sheets, it turns out that suicide rates in states are significantly higher than drunk driving rates in most states. Right? We all know about drunk driving deaths, and in fact, having that knowledge and awareness decreased the rate of drunk driving deaths dramatically. So what happens is that it decreases the likelihood of acting on faulty decision making. And so remember, I said the brain is less flexible. So this works because the person, they may not even be able to think of an alternative. So they may just say, oh gosh, I can't do it. I can't have my gun. But even if they try another method, it's going to be less lethal. It turns out most people don't. They sort of stop, the situation de-escalates, and they have time for the crisis to pass and for intervention. Now, one of the studies that we funded to Dr. Matthew Miller from Northeastern showed that lethal means counseling works. They actually gave out lock boxes. The one thing that was different for firearms than for medication is once people were storing medication safely, they continued that over time, but the rate of safe storage for firearms kind of declined over time. So those people may just need reminders, hey, how's that safe storage going, kind of thing. So it doesn't mean anything that we all have things that we try really hard at, and then over time we just kind of ease off on them or forget about them. But that'll be another next study, like, do reminders help when you do lethal means counseling? Another research finding, specific treatments used by mental health professionals have been proven to help people manage their suicidal ideation and behavior. Now, this is the important point. The treatments help them learn to manage their suicidal ideation and behavior in a time where their decision-making is less than optimal. Most of these treatments involve a written component, and by written, I mean either on paper or in an app or online. And the whole idea is to understand your suicidal behavior and the risk factors that might lead to it. Have a plan for action. So when you're in the throes of that crisis, you don't have to think of what to do because you're probably not going to be that good at it. You're feeling desperate. You think nothing's going to make a difference, but you can pull out your safety plan or your DBT skills and realign your thinking to use the skills that you've learned in these crisis moments. And so what most of these treatments do Well, they're based on what I said. The brains are different. The thinking is different. Decision-making is poor during that time. So what they do is they start off usually with, what are the factors? How do you know when you're running into trouble? You know, how do you know when you're going down that pathway? And the person literally in all of these treatments articulates and writes down what are the ways that they know that they're not doing great. Could be trouble with sleep, could be the drinking more, could be that they're isolating, all those factors I mentioned before. So they write it down so they can remind themselves when they're starting to do that. Oh, this may be something I need to think about. And then a lot of them help people figure out, what can you do for yourself? Who can you reach out to help you? And what should you do in an emergency? So depending on where your brain is at in the crisis, you have alternatives, including the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, 1-800-273-TALK, 8255, or the crisis text line where you can text TALK to 741-741. And there are many other more selective crisis options like the Trevor Project, RAIN, depending on if a person has very unique experiences like trauma or if they're in a high-risk community. So all these treatments, which all of them, the development of them and testing of them in part, not at all, was funded by AFSP. Because in the beginning, these were really novel ideas. The idea, used to be you thought, oh, just treat the underlying mental health condition and the suicide risk will go away, but that didn't happen. And so then the idea that you have to actually actively think about how you're going to stop the behavior and offer a plan came out of these different types of research, and they've really built on each other. So now all of these, you can be trained. There's even a website we funded called Now Matters Now, which was developed by Dr. Ursula Whiteside and people with lived experience, where they go through the DBT skills, and a person who just may be struggling with or without being in therapy can go to Now Matters Now and learn techniques to manage their suicidal thoughts and behaviors, their tendency to react impulsively and other factors, and teach them mindfulness, because that's what mindfulness does. It takes them back to the present, back to the here and now. So all these treatments came out of research and the idea that it's not just the mental health condition. You have to treat the mental health condition, but you also have to address the suicidal behavior in and of itself. So as I said, you have a plan for handling these moments of increased risk. You have the thoughts and behaviors that you can use to slow yourself down, and ideas about what you can do. These plans, these treatments, they have to be flexible, and they are the person's plan. They're not like, I'm a clinician. It's not my plan. It's not going to do any good if it's my plan. It's the plan that I help the person come to so that they will use it. And I visit it frequently with people when I'm working with someone at risk, because people come and go. Things that work sometimes don't work other times. And so it's a living document. And that's why sometimes putting it on an app is really helpful. And there is an app called Safety Plan, Safety Net, maybe. And then one other thought I want to leave you with that I alluded to before with the genetics is that the brain and brain function can actually change as a result of treatment. So we funded Anthony Ruocco, who's at University of Toronto, to study people before and after dialectical behavior therapy. And so he measured their brain activity before and after treatment. And what did he find? He found that if somebody had a deficit, in other words, their functioning of their frontal lobes, this part, if they weren't using them that much, DBT actually increased their brain usage of their executive functioning branch, and that their brain function changed and their behavior changed. When people didn't have that deficit, eventually they changed, but it may not be the best treatment for them. So dialectical behavior therapy was really developed more for people with borderline personality disorder. Maybe they do better with cognitive behavior therapy, suicide prevention. And so this kind of work helps us to figure out which treatment is better for which person. So is your brain can change. You're not stuck in this situation. So I'm going to share another video.
I think one of the important lessons of the research that we do is that suicide prevention is not really about suicide in large part. It's about resilience and paths to resilience. And so if I was a parent, I am a parent, as a parent, I start from the position of saying that my kids are going to encounter distress, because 100% of people out there are going to encounter distress at some point. And how do you learn helpful coping strategies for that distress? And obviously, if you see your kid not using helpful coping strategies or harmful coping strategies or talking about suicide, then you need to escalate that to have a discussion about those specific issues. There's now a safety plan that is used throughout the suicide research world, in which people who are at high risk, who come to the emergency department or come into an office, have a sequence of steps that they can take to prevent suicide. Things like distraction techniques, their own breathing exercises and own internal self-regulating techniques, people that they can turn to for help or support, reasons for living. I think all children, for example, need to be given a toolbox of skills. They need to know that they're going to be in distress at some time in their life. They're going to get a bad mark. They're going to have a breakup. They're going to get into a fight with their parents, and they're going to have to know how to cope with that. And they need to be sent the message that, A, they're going to be in distress. It's going to happen. And what is the sequence of steps that you can take to deal with that distress? The best way that we can send positive messages about suicide prevention is to show examples of resilience, whether it's on TV or really any kind of media. We know that a substantial group of people, a minority, not everybody, but a minority of people will have suicidal thoughts in their life. Most of them won't die from suicide. What we need to do is to give them something that they can identify with. And the more that we can send those kinds of messages, the real messages that do happen, the more that we can be successful in preventing suicide.
I love that. Well, actually, I am a parent. One of the things we're doing because of what he said and what we've learned is we've partnered with Gizmo, which is a program with Gizmo, the therapy dog, that teaches kids about developing their own mental health plan. And so you can see that all our programs come out of the research. Now, this is only a small portion of our research. We have many, many years of really amazing research, and I encourage you to come to our website. But what did I cover today? Mental health matters when you're talking about suicide risk. There are brain characteristics associated with suicide. Thinking becomes less flexible, and usual coping capacities are not accessible. With limited access to lethal means, we can prevent some suicides, and interventions that help people manage their suicidal risk can help them manage a potential suicidal crisis. One more short video, and then we're going to open it up for questions.
Almost half of Americans know someone that has died by suicide, and a third of Americans feel that their life has been changed by losing someone to suicide. So it's not just family members, although family members' losses are profound, but it's our classmates, it's our neighbors, it's our teachers, our pastors, our friends. All sorts of people are impacted by suicide, and what we need to do is remember that we're all in this fight together. Having these experiences of being connected to other people and knowing that you're not alone can be very helpful. I think it's amazing that AFSP is a place that loss survivors and people with lived experience can kind of put their grief into action. We can no longer say, it's just a handful of family members. It's not 6, it's a lot of us. And that can create a lot of political will of people who don't want other families to experience what they're experiencing. And so using it for advocacy or using it to fund research, I think is really an advantage to having AFSP do the work that it's doing.
Okay. So how about some questions? Do we have any questions? Thoughts?
Robert, we have any questions?
Sure, yes,
Dr.
yeah.
Harkavy Friedman?
Okay, why
jump
don't I
in.
stop sharing? Okay.
Yes, yeah, no, thank you again for the presentation. Amazing. People are already asking, in addition to saying, thank you, Dr. Harkavy Friedman, is where do they find those videos again, those clips?
Yeah, so if you go to afsp.org/learning more.
Excellent.
You could also just go to the website and put in research videos in the search function. And we're about to add some more because, you know, we've made these videos with researchers at the International Summit for Suicide Research that we co-host with the International Academy for Suicide Research. And so we have more coming on kids and kid brains and substance use and well, DBT. And so it's a growing library. So feel free to check it out and share them. They're on Vimeo. If you have trouble downloading them, you can find me at AFSP and we'll help you use them.
Congratulations also on the amazing body of work. It's just incredible to see the information that's coming out. I know we talk a lot about, there are a couple of quick questions about means restriction in terms of, we know that firearms are one of the most significant ways that we can impact suicide prevention. What's been the most successful? I know it is difficult in our culture to talk about, and we're moving the conversation to safe storage, not limiting firearms. What techniques are working best these days in terms of means restriction in that category?
So that's a great idea. So one of the things that's been happening more and more is engaging healthcare professionals and mental health professionals in doing lethal means counseling, which is basically saying, you don't even need to know if the person has a firearm at home. If you have a firearm at home, it's best when someone's not feeling well to take it out of the home. Now, in some states, you can't even do that because it's not clear where you can put it. Although there's a new website called Lock to Live. It's started by Dr. Emmy Betts, and it's growing with places that you can safely store your firearms. And by the way, there's also legislation that a person who was suicidal at one point really spearheaded to, there's a no sale list. So if you're worried about yourself, you could put yourself on a no sale list so nobody will sell it to you in a crisis moment. You can take your name off that list, but not in that moment. It takes time, and time is your friend when it comes to guns and suicide. So we're training clinicians to ask about firearms and to encourage people to make them inaccessible. That's why we don't use the word restrict. We say limit access. It could be, you know, taking an important part out of the gun. It could be giving it to somebody else for temporarily. It could be not owning a gun, as Dr. Betts said. But so that's, we're working with the National Shooting Sports Foundation. We have lots of brochures and information that are going to gun ranges and to gun shops to educate them about firearms. Responsibility is really the word. And we've been working with an organization called Affirm, and which works in the medical setting about firearms. And they've now become part of the Aspen Institute. And so we've been giving public talks about how to talk about suicide and firearms. We actually we're excited that we have an editorial coming out in the American Journal of Public Health about this, because it turns out, like at the start of this a few years ago, only about 15% of people knew. And still people don't make the connection between having a gun in their house and the risk for suicide, right? Because you're expecting them to understand the risk for suicide, the warning signs for suicide, identifying somebody as at risk, and then realizing, oh, we have a gun. So we're just trying to even increase the awareness that there's a link, and that hopefully that will also help things.
So in addition to some thank yous that are coming through for the presentation and how brilliant it was, just one last question. We talked about safety planning as one of the techniques to help people who are suicidal. How do you encourage your clients to use safety planning? How do you get them to actually not only write it, but to put it into use?
Well, that's a great question. And just at least the studies with veterans show that you don't have to get them to use it. Once they have it, most of them know they have it. Many people carry it around in their back pocket or on their phone. But the first thing I do in my practice in the very first session is I get 2 consents, at least. I get consent to contact a primary care physician so I know about their physical health, because I've had people in my office where I know that they're having a physical health problem and they don't. And sometimes it's not so easy because of anxiety to get people to go to their doctor. So, and the second is the contact of at least one person I can contact when there's an emergency, if I can't find them or if they're a danger to themselves or others. And I just say, my work is to help you have the best life you can. And what kind of therapist would I be if I didn't do everything in my power? So if I know that you need support from outside, of course, I'm going to contact people. And I have yet to have somebody not give me a name and a number. Now, sometimes they have trouble figuring out who that person is. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the safety plan is the person's plan. It's not your plan. And so they take ownership of it, which means that they know about it and they know, you talk about when to use it. And then third is if I see some of the warning signs coming up, I will ask them, have you checked in with your safety plan? Or how's your safety plan doing? Do we need to update it a little bit? And also anytime I hear there's been a fight with a friend, I'm like, oh, they're on your safety plan, aren't they? Let's take a look at your safety plan. So there are lots of opportunities in our work to just check in about that safety plan or remind it. And I also use it for other things like aggressiveness and agitation, substance use. So it's a very helpful tool for helping people to have guideposts for how to stay safe and healthy.
Thank you so much. Those are outstanding tips. I was actually wondering about the use for anger management. Is there a different safety plan or is it that same sort of idea?
I don't know if there's a formal one yet, but it's the same idea, but you can adapt things. What you want to know for aggression is, what are the things that get you agitated and aggressive? What can you do instead? Same idea. How can you distract yourself with other people? Who can you call when you feel that way? Right? And now sometimes it may be an outside person, not a family member. It could even be your parole officer, by the way. And then emergency contacts. So it's pretty much the same. You want to limit access to lethal means when somebody is agitated, and you want to know what keeps them going. So you may add some things once you know something about what someone's aggression. But a lot of times it's like, when I drink, I get aggressive, or when I drink, I get suicidal. So on your plan, you have, don't drink. Instead, do this, knowing that you're going to want to.
Outstanding.
And if you must, put your gun somewhere else.
Outstanding. No, thank you again for the presentation. The tips very, very useful. With that, I'm going to send it back to Dr. Feldman. Appreciate again you being here, Dr. Harkavy, Friedman, and all the body of research that you've helped corral and get into process these last years.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me and for having this conference. It's really important.